I'm the current chair of these meetings. And just so everybody knows, these meetings will be recorded. You should have seen a little splash bar pop up in front of your screen that if you just click OK, that's you allowing the recording. If you don't want to be recorded, you can just keep your camera off and your mic muted, and you won't be picked up except for your name being as an attendee. So let's see. Typically during these meetings, or we'll start with going over the agenda. Actually, we want to go to the next slide. So today's agenda, beginning pretty similar. We'll do new member introductions and housekeeping, followed by a discussion about new work group chair and co-chair. And then we have a couple presentations lined up today. One is Designing and Evaluating Functional Flows for California's Central Valley Rivers by Ted Grantham. And the other is a method to implement natural flow regimes for regulated rivers by Seth Naman. And then time permitting, we'll go ahead into any roundtable updates for many participants and wrap up and see if there's any agenda topics people want to go over for our next meeting on August 12th. So to start, do we have any attendees that are new to this meeting? This is your first meeting. If so, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can call on you and you can introduce yourself. Let's see. Alessandra?
Hi, I'm Alessandra Rigodrighi. I'm with the State Water Board as well in Division of Water Rights with the Bay Delta section. And this is my first meeting. I have some familiarity with CEFF and Dr. Yarnell's research and excited to be here. Thanks.
Okay, welcome. Anne? Or maybe
sorry, I was muted. Sorry, Ann Mullen.
no
I'm
problem.
with National Marine Fisheries Service, and I'm up in the Willamette Valley in Portland, and we have some interest in how to implement natural flow regimes differently than we have done to date. And so I'm interested in hearing the two talks today. Thank you.
Great. Nate.
Nate Mantua. I'm in Santa Cruz at NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And I'm here because we're working on a number of projects to integrate environmental flow scenarios into salmon life cycle models to evaluate water costs and fish benefits of different flow regimes.
Wayne?
Hi, I'm Wayne Lifton with Stantec. I'm an aquatic ecologist, and I've been around the in-stream and environmental flow business for quite a while, and thought I'd sit in and learn what's going on and learn a bit more about this particular initiative.
Great. Amber.
Hi there, my name is Amber Jamison, and I work with EPIC, the Environmental Protection Information Center. Also been doing a lot of work in the Scott and Shasta, and I just wanted to drop in and see what you guys are up to, and you know, look forward to hearing more about it.
Dan?
Sure. Good morning. Daniel Worth. I'm an environmental program manager at the State Water Board, and I work in the Division of Water Rights in the Bay Delta branch, and I work on updates and implementation to the Bay Delta plan. Not entirely new to these meetings. I've been to some of these meetings, but it's been a couple of years, so I thought I would reintroduce myself.
Thank you. Leanne?
Good morning. I'm an environmental scientist with DWR, and I specialize in environmental compliance for habitat restoration projects, mainly in the Yellow Bypass, but always been very excited and interested in California water things. So nice to meet everyone.
David.
How's it going? David Manthorn. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Region 1 Coast up in Humboldt, Mendocino, and I supervise our water rights coordinator here.
And Jamie.
Jamie Neary. I'm policy director and staff attorney with Russian Riverkeeper up in the Sonoma and Mendocino counties, and just looking to start attending these meetings again. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And oh, it looks like there's one more. Moises.
Buenos días, Moisés Moreno Rivera with Trust for Public Land. Just in listening mode today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Is there anybody we missed?
Hi, my name is Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jeff Micko. I'm a water resources engineer and working in the Central Coast, mostly in the Pajaro watershed. Have a long background in water rights and reservoir operations and environmental flow modeling, and really looking forward to participating in the group. This is an extremely interesting subject for me, and can't wait to hear the presentations.
Welcome. Anybody else we missed? All right. Well, it's great to see so many new attendees. Glad to have you join the work group. So next up, we'll go over new work group chair and co-chair. I recently started a new role with the Division of Water Rights, transferring over into focused on long-term flow development, baseline flow development in the Scott and Shasta, and won't have the capacity to continue to host these meetings. So I'm passing on the torch. Our new work group chair will be Chris Taniguchi-Kwan with SWRCB. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Taniguchi-Kwan. I lead the Eco-Hydrology Research Program at SWRCB, Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. I've been a part of the CEF technical team for many years and really excited to continue to lead this group with you all. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Dan for all the leadership he's done over the past multiple years since the EFLOS work group has been started. I think it was it in 2017 or 2018 when it first got together. So thanks, Dan. You've done an amazing job of really pulling together all these different speakers and organizing all the meetings and continuing to host the work group for all these several years, every single quarter. I don't think we've missed a quarter since. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you. And then our co-chair is going to be hosted by CDFW, and there's going to be two staff that will kind of switch off on hosting. One is Brianna Drescher, and the other is Alyssa Obister. Alyssa's out on maternity leave, so she'll be at one of our future meetings. I'm not sure when she's coming back, but is Brianna on?
Brianna is in the field, so she wasn't able to make it today, but she'll be here at the next meeting to introduce herself.
Okay, great. We'll have, perfect. All right, so any questions about the transfer or anything from anybody? If not, we can jump into our presentations. Let me pull back up just to make sure. Okay. So is Ted, are you on?
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone.
Great.
Sorry.
Are you all ready to go?
I am. Yeah, just give me 1 second to pull up my slides. And let me also take a moment to thank you, Dan, for all you've done for this work group for many years. Really appreciate it. Sorry, just give me 1 second to get my. All right, is everyone seeing my slide deck in the right view?
Yep.
Yes, we can see
Okay,
it
great.
properly.
All right. Well, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for everyone coming. It's great to see such a large group. I'm Ted Grantham. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and I'm part of the technical team that developed the California Environmental Flows Framework. Today, I'll be sharing an effort that's really, I think, like adjacent to Ceph, and is focused on designing functional flow regimes for California Central Valley rivers. And this is part of a larger project that I'm leading called the Collaboratory for Equity and Water Allocations, or COEQUAL. So I'm going to take a little time to share what that project's about. Most importantly, I want to acknowledge all the folks that have contributed to this work and really led this work in many ways. And that's Su-Yan Yi, who's a postdoc here at UC Berkeley, Bronwyn Stanford at the Nature Conservancy, Sarah Yarnell, and Lindsay Murdoch at UC Davis. So this is what I want to go over today in the next, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, and want to leave some time for questions. And I'll share a little bit about this project COEQUAL, which some of you may not be familiar with, and then I'll get into the details for how we're designing what we're calling functional flow regimes for different rivers in the Central Valley, and then I'll share a little bit about how we're actually evaluating environmental flows under alternative operational and climate futures. So I'm sure everyone in this room is aware that we find ourselves in a period of rapid and really unprecedented environmental, social, and political change. And this is true generally, but certainly for California water management specifically. And this is, we're basically realizing that the laws, institutions, and infrastructure that have been designed and built really in a different time motivated by different purposes aren't meeting the diverse needs and values of present day society. And as the effects of climate change and other forms of environmental change intensify, managing California's water to meet really the multitude of objectives will only become more challenging. And so we're facing this critical question, right? Like, what is our water future? How do we decide what our water future is, and who decides? And ideally, how do we ensure that everyone has a voice in that decision? And these broad questions are really what motivate this project COEQUAL, the Collaboratory for Equity in Water Allocation. This project was funded through a recent Climate Action Initiative grant program that was established through a one-time $100 million allocation from the state legislature to support research that advances the state's climate action priorities. And it has a particular emphasis on the impacts of climate change to California's vulnerable communities. And our project was one of about 40 projects funded, and these are high intensity, short-term efforts, 2-year projects that are really charged with delivering actionable results in 2 years. And I'll share a little bit about how we interpret that for this project. The overarching goal of COEQUAL is to establish a more inclusive and participatory process for engaging the public in water planning and water stewardship. So essentially, we're trying to democratize the science and decision making around water management through participatory processes that bring together diverse constituents and parties from across the state. And this is really motivated by the belief that by making water information more transparent and meaningful and accessible, we can accelerate solutions for addressing the state's water management challenges. With that in mind, we have this kind of inclusive governance structure that really relies on input from different stakeholders from across the state. We have a steering committee with about a dozen individuals that include a lot of representatives from state and federal agencies in addition to tribes. We also have this advisory cohort of about 50 people that has more representation from environmental justice community, NGOs, also with tribes and water districts. I'll just mention that there are also these additional use cases in which we're sort of doing a deep dive into particular topics of interest for which we also have advisory groups. These are some of the collaborators involved. The core research team really is primarily comprised of faculty and postdocs and other researchers at academic institutions, primarily from the University of California on different campuses. We also are partnering closely with NOAA Fisheries and folks at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and many of the other agencies and community groups that you see here. The technical approach for this project is really centered around scenario development and exploration using a model called CalSim3, which is an operations model for California's Central Valley. But this project isn't just about modeling. We're also really attempting to connect these scenarios to meaningful priorities and interests for California's communities. And we're doing that particularly through the deeper exploration of these use cases here, which include the environmental flows work, which I'll talk about today. I mentioned we're using CalSim3, so this is a water operations model that represents all of the major water infrastructure in the state, including the Federal Central Valley Project and state water project. This model was developed by the Department of Water Resources and U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, who are responsible for managing this system. And part of the rationale for using this model for scenario exploration is to ensure that this work is sort of aligned with other modeling efforts that those agencies are leading. But what's really new, I think, with this work is that we're trying to explore a much broader range of scenarios. And by that, I mean, operational alternatives and climate futures that have been considered to date. And so this is just a graphical representation of how you might think about the different management alternatives that are typically considered in planning and assessment processes led by state and federal agencies. And basically what we see is that these points are clustered closer together. So we have sort of a pretty narrow range of scenarios. Some scenarios end up giving a little bit more water to hypothetical user A. Others give a little bit more water to user B. But the differences aren't huge. And so with this project, we're really aiming to intentionally expand the scope of scenarios to consider a much broader range of possibilities that depart from our business as usual. So what is a scenario? These are the elements that make up basically our modeling approach. We're basically asking three questions with a scenario: how much water is available, how is it allocated, and what does that allocation actually mean for people and the environment. So to determine how much water is available, we have climate projection data, both historical and current, or in future, that determine how much supply is available to fill our reservoirs and flow through our rivers. We also have storage factored in if there's carryover storage from previous years, and sea level rise is also an important element when thinking about delta exports, for example. How is it allocated is basically determined by the objectives that we set, and this includes water rights priorities, regulations, contracts that basically dictate for a given supply how that water is available for different or allocated to different purposes. And then the outcome is basically how that water is allocated and what it means. And sometimes, this is just, delivering water to a particular water district, and that is the outcome. But in other ways, we need to sort of translate those outcomes into terms that are more meaningful. And so, for example, we're using different linked models like a salmon life cycle model to interpret what different scenarios might mean for salmon populations. I'll also note that these models, the CalSim model is run generally at a 100-year time series at a monthly time step. So these are monthly time step data, which has some sort of inherent limitations in addressing some biophysical processes that may be of interest. So how do we actually decide what scenarios to run? And I think the simplest way to describe this is that we're asking what if, what if questions. What if we made specific changes to the way we operate water in California? What if no changes in operations is made? We just maintain the status quo into the future. What if we were to prioritize water deliveries to communities to meet basic, human health and sanitation and drinking water needs under the human right to water mandate, for example? What if we consider new infrastructure like the Delta Conveyance Project or Sites Reservoir? What would that mean for people and the environment? What if SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is fully implemented? What might that mean for water allocations and the environment? And then finally, this question here is what I'll focus on today, which is basically what if more natural flows were to be restored to rivers and the Delta? What would that actually, what could that look like? And what would that mean in terms of the other uses of water and also the state of our environment? These are the specific environmental flow scenarios, or examples at least of environmental flow scenarios that we're exploring as part of this this project. Under sort of our baseline or kind of current operations, we have some rivers have minimum flow requirements, and these are the tributaries to the Sacramento and San Joaquin River that are shown with those red dots there. This is actually a little bit outdated. We have about 17 locations that we're evaluating environmental flows. A subset of those have some minimum flow requirements, some do not. Because we're interested in these sort of what if scenarios and what happens if you implement certain changes, we're often interested in comparing that with alternative scenarios. And so we're also interested in seeing what happens when you remove all flow requirements from the system and what that means in terms of water deliveries. Today, I'll be talking about what it would look like to implement functional flow regimes or functional flow requirements on major rivers in the Central Valley. And I won't have time today, but we'll also have some work to modify, I think, our functional flow regimes in ways that we think are going to be sort of more salmon friendly, really tailored to the management needs of salmon in Central Valley rivers. We also are exploring some percent of unimpaired flow approaches, which I also want to talk about today, that are aligned with some of the proposals that have been put forward by the Water Board and others. I think most of the folks in this room are familiar with the concept of functional flows. This is a graph that basically shows how different elements of the annual hydrograph support different biophysical functions. So the blue bars basically represent sort of areas of the hydrograph or flow conditions that are associated with particular geomorphic functions. And here in California, many of our native species are really adapted to and rely upon particular elements of the hydrograph to complete their life cycle. So as flows rise in the early winter, that's often a trigger for salmon migration. Salmon spawning may occur at sort of the tail end of larger winter flows. Floodplain rearing and accessibility during higher spring and late winter flows is really important for salmon in particular, but also for other native fish. And then, the spring flow recession is another important element of the hydrograph, which many native animals and plants are sort of cued into. And this functional flows concept is really what underpins our California environmental flows framework, but also is informing our thinking around what a more natural flow regime would look like, or what that might look like for Central Valley rivers. Under this functional flows concept, we've really focused in on these 5 elements that we think are important to consider and to manage for in California's rivers. So these include the fall pulse flow, wet season base flow and peak flows, the spring recession flow, and dry season base flow. And for each of these 5 flow components, we've identified a series of flow metrics that provide quantitative descriptions for what these flows should look like. And we've developed a whole suite of sort of methods to quantify the natural range or the range of these metrics that we think are needed to maintain the ecosystem functions associated with these different flow components. So now I'll pivot a little bit and tell you a little bit about how we're sort of applying this concept to this project, which I shared with you about. So essentially, we have this this five-step process. It all begins with pulling unimpaired flow data from our various sites of interest. And so in California, we have full natural flow or unimpaired flow estimates for many of the tributaries to the Sacramento and San Joaquin and the main stem rivers. These are sort of reconstructed flows that can be used to predict or sort of glean what a natural hydrograph might look like for these highly altered systems. And so once we have those data, we basically apply a suite of algorithms that calculate those individual metrics, which I described in the previous slide. And based on work that Sarah and her student Lindsay Murdoch and what Suyun's been working on, our postdoc, is exploring the relationship between these various metrics. And here's an example of the wet season base flow and water year percentile. And I'll explain sort of why this is helpful. Basically, what this graph is showing is that there is a positive relationship between the water year percentile and the magnitude of wet season base flow. So obviously in a wetter year, as you move towards higher percentiles, you get higher wet season base flow than these low water year percentiles or drought years. And so we can glean these relationships from these unimpaired flow data. And we can determine that for a given water year percentile, let's say the 50th water year percentile, we can say, okay, we need a wet season base flow magnitude of 4,200, CFS, for example. And so we can do this for many of our metrics, and we basically developed a rule set to predict what our different metric values should be under different water year percentiles. Once we have that relationship, we can go to our model data in CalSim, and we can basically predict what those metrics would be under unimpaired conditions and construct a daily hydrograph. So we can predict what our metrics would be, and then we put it all together into a daily hydrograph that we think represents the flows required to sustain these essential ecosystem functions. So there's a little more detail that I could go into, but just the basic idea here is that we're generating a rule set that takes a monthly time series or long-term time series and helps us create actually a daily hydrograph for every water year type at every river of interest across the Central Valley. We can then do this for every water year. And so this is basically an example of the hydrographs, the functional flow regimes, the flows that we think are needed to maintain ecosystem functions at a given site. This is at the Tuolumne River location for wet to dry years. I know this is a lot to look at, but the basic idea here is that the functional flow approach is not just about preserving seasonal dynamics within a river. It's also about maintaining patterns of interannual variability. And that's exactly what we're illustrating here. So the red, for example, is a dry year where you see generally lower flows and earlier spring recession flow, in contrast to, say, a wet year, which are the purple colors, where you see sort of a delayed snowmelt recession, a bigger snowmelt recession, and higher, more sustained winter peak flows. So we've used this approach to basically estimate these functional flow regimes for all of our rivers in the Central Valley. Once we can do that, we can start comparing what our functional flow values or targets with other information. And so here's just one more example that I'll share with you. This is also from the Tuolumne River, where you see 3 different data sources. And so in the green here, we see our functional flow regime. In the blue, we see observed flow from the gauge at this site. And then for orange, you see estimates of unimpaired flow from the CDEC full natural flow gauge. So you can see there's some pretty significant differences between these daily flow data for this particular year. Obviously the unimpaired flows often greatly exceed both the functional flows and the observed flows. You'll note that our functional flow maximum peak kind of gets cut off around this area here, and that is basically to acknowledge or to constrain our high flows to levels that won't overtop levees down in the valley and start flooding out communities or farms. And so that's a necessary constraint at this point, our current landscape, that we can't, if we were to put 20,000 CFS down the Tuolumne River, we'd be causing a lot of damage. You'll also see when we compare functional flows with observed flows that that in this year, this example, for example, our base flows in the summer are generally much higher until we start seeing these pulses later in the summer and so forth. So this is now a basis for kind of thinking about how our current regimes compare to functional flow regimes. Sorry, give me 1 second. So another way to look at these data are here, and this is kind of taking those daily flow data and translating them into monthly water budgets. And here our observed flow is actually the data that we're getting from our modeled scenarios. And so we can compare what our functional flow requirements are with the observed flow under a given scenario, with these unimpaired flow estimates. So this is going to be really helpful as we start exploring a multitude of different scenarios for managing California water. We can see to what extent do our observed, which is really modeled observed flows, meet or exceed our functional flow targets. Do we have enough water in a given month to manage 4 functional flows hypothetically, or are we consistently under budget for meeting those flow needs? So I won't get into details here, but I just wanted to note that after we run these scenarios, we're basically going to be evaluating sort of a broad range of outcomes for what a given scenario means in terms of water allocations for people, for the environment, for different water users. And so we're going to be looking at things like reservoir storage, flows in major rivers, delta outflows, salinity, exports, water deliveries to ag and municipal areas. And then we have a suite of additional metrics that are really going to be focused on, I would say, more nuanced or perhaps more meaningful impacts, things like the economic impacts of curtailing water deliveries to agriculture, for example. We're working with the folks at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center I mentioned that will be coupling the outputs of these calcium scenarios to a life cycle model for winter run Chinook salmon to predict how their abundance and sort of viability of that population may change for a given scenario. And then we'll be evaluating again how these different scenarios may affect our ability to achieve these functional flow requirements in different rivers. There's also a big emphasis on equity, which again I won't have time to discuss today. But if you're interested in learning more about this, I'll just give you that teaser, and we can talk. Ask me later. So I'm kind of wrapping up here, but I just want to take a few take-home points of why I think this work is relevant to this group in particular. We've developed this method to create daily functional flow regimes or functional flow requirements for all major Central Valley rivers for all water year percentiles. And so those are data that might be helpful for other applications. That information is also translated at a monthly time step, which you can think about as a monthly water budget that might be needed to satisfy functional flows or other flow requirements that might be considered. I think really the big value, probably the most significant sort of contribution of this work is the insights that it will yield around the trade-offs that exist in managing water in different ways. So when we implement these types of functional flow regimes, what does that actually mean for different for different water users. I mean, we know that there are these narratives around, fish versus farms, but the reality is that these trade-offs are much more nuanced and complicated, and we hope to bring that nuance, to bear on ongoing policy conversations. And then, finally, I'll say that, and this is largely sort of what I presented today is mostly like a hydrologic, sort of focused assessment of flow conditions. But through the salmon life cycle model and additional work that we're planning, we also hope to link the outcomes of these various scenarios to more direct measures of ecosystem health, which may be of interest to the rest of you as well. So with that, I'll wrap up and love to entertain any questions. I'll just leave you with my email here and the website to our co-equal project, which will be updated, and you can learn a little bit more about this project. And then finally, I also want to circle back and acknowledge all the key folks that have contributed to this work, especially Suyun, Sarah, Lindsay, and Bronwyn. Thanks.
All right. So there's a number of questions that have been asked in the chat, and Sarah has been responding to those as you were speaking.
Okay, great.
So we'll start with any folks that want to ask a question through raising their hand, and then we'll circle back and make sure we address all the questions in the chat. All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this point. If you're having trouble raising your hands and you have a question, you can just jump on. Oh, Amber just raised her hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a possibility to include the economic impacts of, for example, like not delivering enough water down the rivers and the impacts to, not having stabilized salmon populations and downriver communities who depend on, salmon for subsistence, et cetera. I feel like a lot of times it's just like one-sided of whatever brings in a GDP, but I feel like it's not really taking into account like the social, cultural, environmental costs. And I think that, we're starting to learn that there are a lot more costs associated with restoration and recovery. And I feel like that's the other side of the coin that really needs to be included in these academic studies.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree. I think, yeah, I don't think I think that is absolutely a motivation of this work. In fact, I don't think we need to translate everything into dollars and cents to do that type of analysis. I think it's possible to take the salmon model, for example, and translate projections of salmon abundances into economic terms, perhaps. But I think the whole motivation of this work is to better highlight the nature of trade-offs across multiple dimensions, environmental, ecological, socioeconomic, that is not in a way that's actually pretty comprehensive and new. So I totally agree. And we're doing our best to sort of highlight the different benefits and values that people hold around water, and do that in a way that actually does allow for comparison. So you're not just emphasizing, the economic impacts, let's say, of reducing water deliveries to agriculture.
Right. Well, just in like the flow setting process on the Scott and Shasta rivers, I'm noticing that they're doing, they're number one, electing to not do any kind of like recovery flows or functional flows. It's the bare minimum baseline survival flows. And then also they're only doing the economic study that really seems to focus on, impacts to agriculture, and they don't really value the, economic impacts to downriver communities. And so I'm finding that there is kind of a need for it. And the water board is always asking for, show us the numbers. What is the, show us where you have the studies for the economic impacts. And then we just don't have them because it's up to like nonprofits or fishing, groups or tribes to try to like put together an economic impact study for these like huge projects. And it's just not financially feasible for these small organizations to try to advocate for the, salmon and the rivers. But big ag definitely, has a lot of influence. And I feel like a lot of the agencies are just going gung ho on, you know, putting together the economics of the other side and not presenting both sides equally. And so I feel like now we need really academics to step in and start fulfilling that need. If there's any way that you guys could do that, that would be a tremendous help, especially, you know, in working on the Scott and Shasta. I know that it would be helpful up there.
Thanks for your comment, Amber. Kathy?
Kathy.
Good morning. So my question has to do with groundwater and how much is the groundwater included in the model? Because if we have no groundwater, basically we have there's the majority of our flows in the tributaries and the streams come from groundwater. So if we're not accounting for the impacts to the groundwater, how can there be an accurate accounting of the flows in the model? And the other thing, for the people from the water board, my understanding about Shasta is that Nestle is now in Shasta pumping out tons of groundwater. Will the impacts of the companies that are pumping out groundwater be able to be included in your model? Because that is a direct impact to the flows also. And I'm understanding too that the bark beetle is now being seen in Shasta because of all the groundwater usage. Thank you.
I'll just respond briefly to that. There is a coupled groundwater model with CalSim 3. It's called CV2SIM or something like that. Yeah, and it does account for groundwater pumping and surface water groundwater interactions. I think it's a pretty coarse spatial scale, and it's not perfect, but for all of the scenarios that we're running, we are looking at groundwater declines or impacts in the Central Valley, so in the Sacramento Valley and the San Joaquin Valley, and that also affects river flows in those rivers to the extent that they're coupled. So it doesn't get at all of the, I think, dynamics that would be, you know, potentially relevant for, you know, managing flows for fish, but it is it's part of the assessment. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I can address the Scott Shasta two questions so far at the end of this. Any other questions for Ted verbally? Okay, not seeing any hands. So let me just run through the chat and make sure that all of these have been addressed. And if you haven't looked at the chat for some of the additional questions, I encourage you to.
Okay. Angelina, do you have another question?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. You mentioned something about a 2-year time frame. I'm perhaps that if you could clarify what you meant about your 2-year time frame. Is this prior to implementation? And I am curious how these efforts are feeding into the sites and Delta conveyance projects.
So the 2-year time frame is the scope of this co-equal project. That is a scenario, like a collaborative scenario modeling project where we're exploring these alternative water management scenarios and alternative water climate futures for California. There is no direct tie with this project in any current or ongoing regulatory actions that are in conversation. So we are including some scenarios because they're available to represent the Delta Conveyance Project, for example. But this is a university-led research project. This is not a regulatory process, even though we are collaborating and talking to agencies, NGOs, water districts, et cetera. So I hope that clarifies. Our primary outcome, or like one of the key deliverables for this project, is going to be a website that hosts all of these different scenario data that we hope will be of interest and useful for different folks that are advocating for different changes in California water management. But that is, like, we are not actively or directly engaged with any of these current conversations around water infrastructure or policy changes.
Okay, and I guess my quick follow-up question to that is, how do you envision implementation? Because I know, like, as Amber was alluding, in the Scott and Shasta, it's one thing to understand the scientific requirements of the ecosystem, and it's a very different thing to understand how agencies enforce curtailments and how agricultural producers can prepare for various amounts of water during wet and dry years. Is there any effort going toward streamlined and effective implementation once these functional flows are determined?
Not within the scope of our project. I think that it's possible that the outcomes from this analysis will help to inform those types of implementation efforts, and we hope that they will. I think by identifying and characterizing the sort of the nature of trade-offs of, like, not only characterizing the functional flow needs, but also the nature of trade-offs, it will actually equip different interest groups to advocate for particular policy changes. But that's outside of the scope of this project. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Kathy, did you have another question?
Yeah, I just have one more question. So I know that there are groundwater management authorities in the different regions. Will this modeling program have an impact? Will they be using this as a tool to properly determine how to assess groundwater resources? Because right now, I mean, I've read the white paper, and the white paper is really shameful in that it doesn't guarantee water to the smaller communities. There's like a cap and trade or whatever that they're going to be doing with groundwater. So how will this, or can it be used to help them properly manage groundwater resources so that the smaller communities are not excluded from receiving, a good quality drinking water source? And then can this be used to make the case? I know this is a little bit more political than what researchers like to get into, but the flood irrigation for export-only farms in the state of California is what is helping to dry out the aquifers even more and take up our water resources even more. So how can this be used to show that the flood irrigation needs to stop and needs to end, for data collection?
So I'm not sure I fully understood your first question about whether and how this information can be used to inform, I assume, implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I think, what is within the scope of this project is that we are designing particular scenarios that would simulate what SGMA implementation would look like. Essentially, we restrict groundwater pumping across the valley, and we can see how that would then affect the economics of agricultural land use, as well as the potential environmental benefits of improving, or of restoring groundwater levels and potentially surface water groundwater interactions. Most of the work that's happening around groundwater sustainability plans that are happening at sort of the basin scale, involve developing very specific, locally calibrated, groundwater models that are not, that are not integrated into what we're doing. And so I suspect that while we can provide sort of this broad brush perspective on, the implications of implementing SGMA or not, what that would mean, we're not going to be directly informing, the development of those local groundwater sustainability plans. To your second question around, irrigation practices, again, we're mostly focused on sort of bulk deliveries of water, and I think where we get at things like changes in irrigation practices is mostly through, kind of course changes in irrigation efficiency that could be represented by, let's say, transitions from flood to drip irrigation. And those types of demand reduction scenarios and that are motivated by or implemented through conservation measures will be included. So I think that the some of what you're looking for may be included, but I would say that again, the real, I think, contribution of this work is looking at the statewide perspective of trade-offs across different objectives for the Central Valley, and a lot of the really highly localized area issues are not going to be adequately described. All right, I don't know where we are with time, Dan, but I really appreciate all the feedback and questions.
I think we're pretty good with time, so thank you all for your questions, or we should be moving along with our meeting. Okay. If you have additional questions, maybe keep an eye on the chat tab and you can help Sarah address some of those.
Okay, yeah, I'll scan them now. Thanks all.
Okay, and then just circle back on a couple Scott and Shasta questions. One was on the groundwater modeling information, and we are working with the GSA and Siskiyou County GSA to collaborate on development of surface water and groundwater models that include all of the known surface water and groundwater diversions and as part of our analysis. And those we're hoping to have draft models out in the fall. So keep your eye out for those. As far as, and then generally when we move through our curtailments in those watersheds under the current existing emergency regulation, it would be by order of priority. So I don't know where Nestle falls in with the order of priority. I'm kind of new to the project. I'm still trying to work through all those components. There's a lot going on there. So I'm not sure on that specifically, but it would be by order of priority. And with the groundwater, the priority is a little bit different than surface water since it's not an adjudicated system, or the groundwater is not adjudicated. And then circling back on the economic impact question, the economic impact that the board is starting to develop, we'll be looking at impacts on fishing and agriculture, as well as tribal impacts and associated indirect impacts, baseline flows, looking both ways at having baseline flows and impacts of, or the kind of the benefits of having those flows for fishing and tribal communities. So hopefully that addresses those questions. I don't want to get too sidetracked in this meeting on Scott Shasta specific. We have separate meetings that we have where we can address those specific questions. So moving back to the agenda. Next up, we have a presentation on a method to implement natural flow regimes for regulated rivers. Seth, are you? Oh, you're right there in front of me. Morning, Seth. We'll hand it over.
Hey there, good morning everyone. Thanks for having us. I'm Seth Naiman. I'm a fish biologist with National Marine Fisheries Service in the Arcata office. And I have with me also here my co-author, Nick. Nick, you want to introduce yourself? Nick might have stepped away. He also had a competing presentation, so he might be doing that. Anyway, my co-author is Dr. Nick Somm with the USGS Co-op unit at Cal Poly in Humboldt here. And Nick and I have worked closely over the years together on a variety of projects, including this one. So let me pull this up here. And figure out which screen is going to work. How's that look to you guys? To me, it doesn't look that great, but hopefully on your screen it does.
It looks good.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for having us. This is as a lot of you are very interested in the subject of natural flow regimes and ways that we can solve some of the problems that dams and reservoirs have created for rivers. And as Ted showed us, communities and also the people and the species upon which rivers depend, we are very excited to help bring some progress and some resolution to some of these problems. Okay. I'd just like to start out, this talk by saying, as I do for a lot of these talks, that rivers throughout the Western United States and throughout the world have supported Native American, tribes and Native peoples since time immemorial. And yeah, just want to say thanks again for this forum, for this group, for facilitating multi-agency collaboration. We need more of this stuff to spread the word, help each other learn, and to, really diversify our knowledge base collectively and advance these projects that I think everyone on this call is passionate about. So some of the just quick take-home messages from this talk is, we've had these scientific recommendations over the last 3 decades that are pretty much unified on the need to restore natural hydrographs to rivers. But really implementation has been lacking. We really have very few examples of where any of these, dozens and dozens and dozens of papers in the scientific literature have been implemented. And really throughout the Western United States, there's just still these simplistic reservoir storage and dam release rules that continue to degrade salmon habitat. This is just a quote I like: simplistic and static environmental flow rules are misguided and will ultimately contribute to further degradation of river ecosystems, by Angela Arthington. And again, the literature is, it's been out there for 20 or 30 years, and we're just still, unfortunately, now trying to get some of these things on the ground and get the dam operations up to speed with where the literature has been for over 20 years. So the outline for my talk today, I'm just going to go over some background information. I'm going to talk about a specific example, the Trinity River, which a lot of you are familiar with. It's part of the Central Valley Project. Ecological effects of the flow alteration on that river, the real-time flow management tool that Nick and I developed, and some of the results. Ted gave us a good talk and showed, statewide map and everything, and we need a lot of these approaches because it's a, huge problem. And I'm gonna kind of focus in on one example river system on the Trinity River and go into more detail on that. So some of the background information: Trinity Dam began partial regulation of the Trinity River in 1961. This is a picture of the dam. It's a large earthen fill dam, creates Trinity Reservoir, stores about 2.4 million acre feet of water. That's Lewiston Dam, which is like a re-regulation reservoir. And then there's a tunnel that goes through the side of the mountain, just kind of right there above the hatchery, and that diverts water over to Whiskeytown Reservoir. This is just a little graphic of that. So Trinity Dam is about 20 miles long or so. Again, storage 2.4 million acre, or about 2.4 million acre feet, average annual inflow about 1.2 million, and approximately half goes to Central Valley annually, and about half down the Trinity River, and there are some water years. It's not always half, but on average, it's about that. And that green line you see there is the tunnel that goes over to Whiskeytown Dam. So these are some of the gauges I'm going to talk about today. Trinity River is the largest tributary to the Klamath River. You're obviously looking at a picture of Northern California here. I won't read all these out, but there's several of them, several gauges. These are a lot of the kind of undammed gauges in the area. And let's see, can you guys see my cursor? Does my cursor come up on here? Maybe not. Trinity Dam is right here, and that's Trinity Reservoir right here. So there's several gauges.
We can see it, but it's faint.
Okay. So there's several gauges here that we're gonna discuss today. And oh, Nick, I introduced you, by the way.
I heard. I got pulled away to deal with it.
Yeah,
Okay.
We figured so. Okay, so those are these are the gauges we're gonna discuss today that are in the area. Most of these are the undammed gauges. Some do have a small amount of water use on them, but largely undammed. The few that we're gonna focus on here are Trinity River above Coffee Creek and Salmon River above Sums Bar. I'll just go back to the slide real quick. That's what these dark areas are, highlighting these basins. One important thing is they share these common mountain ridge lines. So, you know, if you're a drop of water falling at the top of the mountain, you go 1 foot one way, you're going into one basin, you go 1 foot the other way, you're going into another the opposite basin. They're all pretty much rain and snow runoff with a low base flow index. So as a lot of you know, these rivers get highly altered when a dam and a large dam and reservoir are put in place. So these are each of the hydrographs for 1912 to 1961. And as you can see, you know, flows were high and variable. We had flows of, you know, up to 40,000 CFS in some years, a lot of variation in the winter. This is the snowmelt area here, and just each year is different. Each year is a snowflake, never the same. So the Trinity River Division of the Central Valley Project, which I showed you. And again, can you guys see my screen okay? In my version, okay. I'm online on the browser version of WebEx, so I can't see it. Anyway, the top A there, what you see is the river flow. The black lines in each one of these graphs indicates the 1961, basically when the dam was installed. So you can see that, you know, right here in 1961, basically right after that, how low these flows are from here on out. And again, that's because in these years, about 90% of the flow was being diverted, and now it's around 50% of the flow. So you can see a little bit of improvement here in 2000 when the record of decision was signed. But I'll just go over these real quick. B is the correlation with that Salmon River at Sums Bar gauge. So before the dam was built, the correlation between Trinity River at Lewiston and the Salmon River at Sums Bar was around 80%. So pretty high correlation coefficient between the two. But when the dam was installed, the correlation dropped substantially. So basically what that means is that before the dam was built, the two rivers were essentially synchronized. And after the dam was built, they became desynchronized or decoupled. And then this is the, C is the annual coefficient of correlation. You can see a lot more variability in the correlation, annual correlation coefficient after the dam was built. D is the Richardson-Baker flashiness index. So think of this as a measure of kind of how variable the stream flows are. So what you can see here is before the dam was built, this Richardson-Baker flashiness index was about 0.16 or so, pretty variable, but it dropped, precipitously here to 0.05. So basically what that says is flows became a lot less variable and more static after the dam was built. This BFI is called the base flow index. So essentially meta is very low before the dam was built and then increased and more variable after the dam was built. So most Mediterranean rivers are going to have a really low base flow index. And rivers generally only have a high base flow index when they're a groundwater dominated river. So essentially what we did is kind of turned this metric for the Trinity River into it's more like a groundwater dominated river now with a high summer flow. This is just, let's see, on your y-axis here is the correlation of and this is from Kondoff and Batala, 2005. And what this said, this is, Y is basically a correlation between flows after the dam was built and before the dam was built. And impounded runoff is a proportion of basically how much storage the reservoir has relative to the average annual basin yield. So as I said before, Trinity River has about 1.2 million acre feet basin yield. Storage is 2.4 million acre feet. So it stores about twice the average flow. And so all this is saying is that basically as you increase the amount of storage from a reservoir, you basically decrease the correlation between pre and post dam. So you're increasing the hydrologic alteration of a river the larger the reservoir is relative to how much it can store. And Trinity River, I plotted there for you in the red. So in 2000, there was a record of decision signed on the Trinity River, and it had these 5 water year types here that you can see going from critically dry here in the purple to extremely wet in the yellow. And this was considered groundbreaking at the time, but as you can see here, there's no fall or early spring flows. In all cases, in all water year types, the river is flatlined here at 300 CFS for basically the entire winter when you would have had the most variable stream flows historically. So what are some of the ecological effects of doing that? Well, there's a whole list of them. I'm not going to read all these out, but I think a lot of people on the call are familiar with these. I'm going to talk quickly about reduced sediment transport that occurs and some of the other ecological effects. As a lot of you know, the list is long, what these dams do and reservoirs do to rivers. I'm going to talk about suppressed growth of juvenile salmonids and lack of triggering flows for juvenile salmonids. And I'm going to try and wrap this up by 11:30, which will give us about 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to blast through this stuff here. So I don't know if any of you remember the Carr Fire, probably a lot of you do, but the Carr Fire in 2018 basically came up from Reading, came over the ridge into a drainage called Deadwood Creek, which is the first tributary downstream from Lewis and Dam. It's only about a quarter mile downstream from Lewis and Dam. Following water year 2019, we had a big storm and it basically had this huge fire scar and blew out Deadwood Creek, which you see there. And if you can look and see, there's this huge delta with fine sediment deposited here. The dam is up here, and basically the river wasn't able, because dam flows are so low, the river wasn't able to transport any of that fine material coming in from the creek. And basically Todd Buxton, who's a geomorphologist with Trinity River Restoration Program, estimated that about 730 Chinook reds were essentially probably failed in that year because they were essentially smothered with fine sediment. That's around 2 million eggs. And this happened again in 2023 and even years in between there. I just happened to take these pictures 2023. So These lines, right, the arrow right here points to that mouth of the creek, and there's the bridge that you saw there. So basically all of these reds in here annually after that fire were getting smothered, and basically the fish that were spawning there basically failed to their reds probably failed altogether. In terms of juvenile growth, so one thing that's really interesting about the Trinity River and a lot of these rivers, even Sacramento, because the reservoirs are so big and so deep, Trinity Reservoir is around 350 feet deep. Water comes out of the hypolimnion. So when we have those big spring flows, like I showed you as part of the restoration in the spring, what happens is that reduces the water temperature. And so what you see here on the left are the actual water temperatures. And what I point you to here is in April, if you look at a lot of these are each year, 2000 to 2019, each one of these lines. What you see here is you begin this warming pattern in the spring right here. Well, right here in May, again, hopefully you can see my cursor, but in May right here is when we release all those flows out of the reservoir, and you can see this big decline in each one of these lines. This dark bar right here is the optimum juvenile growth right here. So just as the river is becoming optimal for juvenile growth, we hit it with a cold shower and we basically cool it off, and it's reducing the growth of juveniles in the river. And right here is a kind of an unimpaired flow scenario on the right. And as you can see, without the dams, the river would warm in this natural pattern, and there would be all these days, all this time right here when juvenile salmonids are growing, that they would be in their optimal growth range and they would grow faster. And we're actually, I don't particularly like this graph, but we're actually able to measure it with the rotary screw trap results. And the dark bars here are before the record of decision, so before 2000, and the light bars are after. And what I would just want you to point you towards is after the record of decision, the post rod, before the record of decision, the pre-rod period, the dark bars, these fish are actually larger in the spring before the record of decision. So when we quote unquote restored the river in 2000, we essentially cooled it off a whole bunch and we made our fish smaller. And if you know anything about survival of salmonids going out to sea, smaller juveniles going out to sea is not a good thing. Lack of flow variation for juvenile salmonids. I won't go over this too much. But Sturrock et al. Here, this is an example from the Stanislaus River. A lot of you have seen this paper. It's basically, like, I would point you towards this graph A right here. These are like average flows before the dam, or annual flows before the dam was built, and here's after. And you can just see how much flows were reduced. And essentially, if you look at C and D here, this is a year in which they had, there was higher flows, and these flows were basically coupled with the total emigrants. And in here, a year with lower flows, basically the high flows in the winter supported fry migrants. And what they saw was lower, less variable flows in the winter were associated with reduced fish production. That's because basically the fry migrants got ignored. And so when you had a lot of fry migrants coupled with high flows in the winter, they got a lot of fish production. So this is, if you think about it, this is the Trinity River's hydrologic portfolio to which salmon developed their life history patterns. And these, we took all of this variation in the winter and we put it into these black lines right here. So we basically shoved the hydrograph down from, thousands of CFS to 300. And then we pushed the whole thing to the right. So if you can imagine, that's going to really basically constrain the life history expression and the support for the portfolio that salmon developed. So this graph is similar. This is from Nyman et al. 2008, which I showed before, and it's similar to a graph that Ted showed us earlier. And you know, Nick and I saw this, and we said, well, how can we, you know, we know that these components of the flow regime, like Ted mentioned, there's these, you know, in the CEF framework, there's 5 components of the hydrograph, and so here we have those components, and Nyman et al. Envisioned this hydrograph, but also synchronized with the natural flow regime. So Nick and I asked ourselves, well, how can we do this? How can we operationally make this happen? And that brought us to the tool here that we want to talk about today. So can we implement a real-time flow regime mimicking nature and synchronize our dam releases with it? So a couple of foundations of our tool are 2 things. In this case, for Lewiston, the flows at Lewiston, this is a 1958 example. Flows are simply a multiple of the discharge at any of the other gauges. Okay, as you can see here, you can see how this is, again, 1958 pre-dam. You can see how closely each one of these gauges follows each other. And this occurs because the linear distance between these gauges is less than the geographic scope of storms. And also, people don't think about this too much, but it is kind of a factor, is that the basin above a certain gauge is fixed on a geologic timescale. So basically, the Trinity River above Coffee Creek, for example, always accounts for 22% of reservoir inflow, no matter what. Pretty much every single year varies very little. And that's because it's always making up a fixed proportion of the total inflow into the reservoir. And you can see, like, here's an example storm right here. This storm, it goes from, you know, San Francisco to Portland. This was just in beginning of April. So that's like 600 miles. If I drew this box for you on this map right here, you wouldn't be able to see it. So those are kind of 2 of the foundations of our tool here. So we have, anytime you're going to implement something like this, as a lot of you know, you're going to need to have constraints, right? You've got a water year volume, you know, maybe you only have so much volume each year. You've got flooding, you've got diversion season you have to make. Whatever it is, you have to have constraints. So our tool has these constraints. These are the ones we've used for the Trinity. They're the water volume total, so there's 5 water year types. The infrastructure downstream the infrastructure at the dam's maximum is about 11,000 CFS. So that's one of the constraints in our model. Downstream, we have a flood risk issue, so we can't exceed 18,000 CFS, about 40 miles downstream. And there's ramp up, ramp down rates, right? As you're at your dam, you can't go from, you know, 10,000 CFS to 300 in 2 hours. You have to ramp it down. So that's another constraint in our model. And the flow schedule, like there are minimums. In the summer, we have this 450 CFS minimum. We approach that as a constraint. We didn't attempt to alter the summer flow minimums or the winter flow minimums. The winter flow minimum is 300 CFS. The summer flow minimum is 450 CFS, which I won't get into that. But so those are some of the constraints in the model. So basically, as I mentioned before, each gauge is like a multiple of the other. So our tool relies on a multiplier And we're basically taking one of the unimpaired gauges and we're gonna use that on any given day as a basis with a multiplier to develop our daily flows. So in the beginning of the water year, when there's little information, our multiplier is fixed and conservative. And then later in the year, as information grows, we use the B120 monthly forecasts. We have waters coming into the reservoir. We use an optimized function and based on those forecasted water year volumes in following months. And then after the water year is known in April, we use an optimized function of the actual water year designation. So again, we're just taking one of those gauges and multiplying it by a number, and then the model is optimizing that multiplier based on the constraints and other factors. So the optimization, it's a loss function. It's basically a measure of imperfection. It penalizes for not spending all of the water year volume, and the optimized weights lead to the least annual underspending, and we're trying to maximize habitat at the time the fish are using it in the winter. Nick, do you have anything to add?
Just that could be customized to any scenario. We wanted to make sure that we expended all the water that was allocated. And like Seth mentioned, we're really trying to fill in that winter, early spring period. And so our approach for that was, we came from the salmon habitat perspective. That's obviously not the only reason to think about flows in that time of year. And so really what that does is it leads to the fewest days where you're just at those base flow levels in the winter and early spring, that part of the loss function.
Yeah. And in terms of those constraints too, Ted's talk got me thinking we could really use some of the Ceph metrics. You could put those in as constraints in our model. So that's a way we can kind of marry some of those Ceph metrics with our technique here. Importantly, we use basically a 5-day advanced river forecast. So that is one of the things that we have in our model and one of the ways we envision it being implemented. We've worked pretty closely with the California Nevada River Forecast Center to they have prediction points on the Trinity River. And so we can use that. We use those predictions in our model. And so we can essentially have RTM operating on an hourly time scale, and we can create a predicted flow release for the dam so that the public can basically have a 5-day advance warning for the river flows that are expected from the dam. Some of the results here, I'll try and blast through this. So the annual water volumes, we almost always spent all of the water. In very rare cases, we had some water left over, basically in some of the critically dry years. But other than that, we almost always spent the water year volumes. There's a couple years here where we had these like a crash to minimum right here, and we kind of ameliorated that by developing a descending limb for that final part of the snowmelt hydrograph. And so here's some examples. Sorry, the title came out a little funny there, but here's some 2013 is a dry year and 2019 is a wet year. So what we have here is the green line would be the flows released from Lewiston Dam. Again, these are synchronized with nearby tributaries. So a lot of the metrics and whatnot for percentiles and how much water you would be expected to achieve in a median time medium 50% flows and that kind of stuff. Those are like an emergent quality of all of our years put together. And so our method results in, essentially a unique hydrograph for each water year type, because every single water year for millennia, over 10,000 years or whatever, every single water year is different in the way it comes down the river. And some of those properties, like, it's typically this flow and this water year type, are basically aggregates all of these together. And our method results in a unique hydrograph every single year. We improved a lot of those metrics that I showed you before. For example, here, if you look at the green line, this is the correlation of the Salmon River at Sums Bar versus the previous method. The record of decision method resulted in about 20% correlation. And for the RTM, we got back up to about that 80%. The Richardson-Baker flashiness index, we basically increased the variability of the river. And base flow index didn't really change much because, like I said, we treated that summertime flow as fixed. And the annual coefficient of correlation is actually a little bit closer to how it was historically, because the record of decision flow made the correlation made it higher than it was historically. Here's correlation coefficients for 2004 to 2023 for all of those gauges. And I would just point you towards this bottom row. The record of decision basically had almost, for all of those years, had almost no correlation with any of the other gauges. But here on the top, our flow tool resulted in pretty high correlations for several of the gauges in the area, which we're really happy with. This is just, and I know we probably don't have time to get in this too much, but this is a daily coefficient of variation. So basically, those annual coefficient of variations are calculated each year, and this calculation calculates it across all years for each day. And so I think what I want you to, the take-home message from this is that the record of decision, is resulting in basically zero variation in flows over years for the entire winter, when this is historic. The blue is the historic before the dam was built. Green is our method right here. So before the dam was built, flows in November, December, January, highly variable, just like I showed you. And the record of decision flows, by having it zeroed out here, is providing the fish with no variation in the winter months when they would have experienced a really high degree of variation. And so it's basically where we've simplified the selection pressure and on these fish, and our method helps restore that. Just a quick look at suspended sediment transport. Because the real-time flow management tool is synchronized with tributaries, we did some calculations here based on some methods that were in that paper I showed you before. And we transported a lot more sediment with our method because the flows are synchronized from Lewiston Dam. And they're also higher in the winter. And so, the bottom line is all of those fish, all of those eggs that died, all the failure of all those reds in 2019 and also subsequent years, if we were implementing the real-time flow management tool, that would not have occurred. We would have been able to transport that sediment downstream. We are happy to report that the real-time flow management tool is being analyzed as one of the alternatives in the reinitiation of consultation on the Trinity River Division, and we helped develop that alternative. And with that, I take questions, and questions for Nick too.
Thank you. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand or drop them in chat. There is one question in chat. Are there more than one species of salmon with different portfolios, e.g. seasons that might have varied needs in the Trinity?
Yes, there's in terms of salmonids, there's Chinook salmon, spring and fall, and there's coho salmon and also steelhead. So we have 3 different species of salmonids. There's also Pacific lamprey, as well as other native fishes. So there are other species that would basically benefit from this, but in a lot of cases, actions that benefit one species of salmonid in almost all cases benefit the others. So in terms of a holistic approach to flow restoration, if we're taking steps that are going to benefit, say, Chinook salmon, in all likelihood, it's going to benefit coho and steelhead as well.
And we can extend that too to other species. There's been other work that's shown that the rod flow regime gets in the way of successful reproduction for other animals like frogs and turtles. And so removing that really cold late push of water and moving more variable flows earlier in the year will remedy some of those issues as well.
Another question in the chat. Does your objective function include penalties for exceeding channel capacity incidents?
Channel capacity incidents, that sounds like flooding. I guess, correct me.
I'm guessing it's flooding, yeah.
Yeah, so it does. We basically have a single point downstream that has the cap as it relates to our flooding. So you see there, it's about 40 miles downstream. There's actually a gauge not too far from there, so we can use the predictions of that gauge coupled with our flow schedule that comes out based on the 5-day advanced flow predictions to ramp down what our function might suggest for flows to make sure we don't do flooding downstream.
And then I had a quick question, which looks like it's kind of on this screen right here. So are you operating the changes in the flow pattern with the same environmental budget of water? Or does this have more water assigned to it? So it's same budget, just changing the way it's allocated.
Exactly. Right. Which again was a constraint.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying that's, it's a constraint. It's the world we had to live in. You could implement this in a world or river where that wasn't a constraint.
Another question in chat, is the real-time flow regime being implemented or is it conceptual?
Right now, it is not being implemented. Like I mentioned, it's being analyzed as a NEPA alternative. As a lot of you know, to implement things like this is a major operational change. So it needs to be analyzed under NEPA. So we're doing that. We have another method that we worked with our colleagues on that has been implemented in the Trinity River, was implemented last year and previous years, and we did do a synchronized flow event in the Trinity River, as well as increased wintertime flows. That's actually, there's the alternative we're talking about in the NEPA document has those 2 methods as an alternative to A and B. And so there's definitely movement on the Trinity River towards basically having, letting water go out of the dam in the winter when the water is supposed to be coming down the river.
And I guess I want to tag onto that too. We spent a lot of time early on in this working with BOR and asking questions about, like, is this feasible? And so we've actually gotten a lot of positive feedback from them. That's part of the reason they're considering this in their analysis. We even met with dam operators to ask, like, hey, is this something that you could actually handle? We got positive reports on that as well. I see there was a question about how much less water would be exported to the Sacramento. Again, that's a constraint, zero. There's zero change in export to the Sacramento here. We developed this to be compliant with all laws, rules, just policies in terms of water allocation in the Trinity and Sac.
Another question in chat, is there still a distinct spring and fall run timing, and is there a distinct outmigration peak for each? What was the original pre-dam spring run numbers?
Yes, there are still distinct spring and fall run returning to the Trinity River. In terms of outmigration, generally the spring fish outmigrate a little bit earlier just because they're a few months older. If they stay in the river, then they might outmigrate as one plus fish. But yeah, there's still spring and fall run in the river, and then historic numbers of we do have actually some of that. Historic numbers of spring run were definitely in the tens of thousands. We do have that information. I don't have it off the top of my head, but yeah, there's a lot of spring run. I mean, all of the tributaries upstream of that now flow into Trinity Reservoir, those cold snowmelt dominated streams, and there was certainly a lot of spring run Chinook salmon that returned to those streams.
Then next question, how does drought work in all of this with the flow variation modeling, given all allocations are accommodated? Maybe you could go back to that slide you had that showed
Seth
the dry year.
mentioned the year.
Which slide?
One you had the water year types, I think.
Yeah. So in the most extreme droughts in the period of analysis we had, those were the years, one in particular, where we didn't spend all the water, blindly applying this method, and I think the main point is we're not suggesting that anyone on October 1st hit a button on a computer and then walk away for 8 months, right? Like, you still would want to monitor how the water year's playing out. And if it looked like it was an extreme drought and not enough water was going to be expended, then you could make some more heavy-handed decisions about some active management. Maybe turn this tool off in a really extreme drought year. Maybe that would be the right decision. But for the vast majority of water years, at least in the analysis that we conducted, you could implement this all year long.
Yeah. What's cool about that is and implementing our method, you can kind of see it here in this 2013. We have years that are dry years in the record, and we actually get a really high flow in a dry year because you just had, like in this case, in 2013, we just had one big set of storms that came through in December, and that was it for the whole water year. And because we're able to synchronize the dam releases with that, we actually got that flow, we got high flows, and we synchronize it. So we're actually able to, like, for example, do some geomorphic work in a dry year versus before, we would store the water, then release it later in the spring, but only a little bit because it was a dry year. Now it's not synchronized because we're releasing it in the spring. So now it's doing less geomorphic work. So our method really helps, essentially capture that variation. And, if you're aggregating things into averages and medians and all of that, you really miss the ability to do that.
Yeah, and here also, just to add on to that, there is a flow requirement during drought years that is already being implemented, and you're just reshaping when those flows occur during that dry year.
Correct.
Next question is, I'm sure I missed this, but imagine temperature was a constraint as well. Did you run into any issues with either summer holding temperatures due to less flows provided in the summer, or were there any time periods when modeled temperatures became an issue for a particular life stage?
So the minimum flows we didn't change. So that's another constraint. There's as Seth mentioned, 450 minimum in the summer, 300 in the winter and spring. It's higher in the summer. I know that sounds crazy, but that's to make the water colder for spring Chinook, which was mentioned a little bit ago, but we didn't change the minimum flows. So even though the flow regime in the spring is altered because of the flow scheduling, it's not in the summer. It's not altered.
And we do have some results in a white paper for other method that basically shows when we basically have less water here in the spring. We're warming the water up more and fish are growing faster. So in this kind of May and June, our method does result in warming temperatures, but that's how we want it to be, because actually these volumes right here, all this volume out here in the spring and summer is not good for the river. It's not good for fish. As Nick mentioned, we've basically shown too, it's bad for turtles, bad for frogs. And so we're basically helping the river kind of return to a more natural state sooner in the spring.
And from a cold water storage component, you'd kind of be entering the warmer season with about the same amount of water in the reservoir, so you'd be operating with the same, pretty much same temperatures throughout.
Yeah, because the flow volumes are maintained. You're exactly right, Dan.
Well, I would say in some years it's actually going to be a higher storage, because basically what's happening now, particularly with climate change, we're getting more water coming in as rain, right? The precipitation is maybe similar, but we're having less snowpack, more rain, more focused in the winter. And so our method actually essentially reduces spill, reduces the need for safety of dam releases. And that modeling is going to bear out in some of the calcium results. So our method is actually beneficial for dam operators, irrigators, and whatnot, because we're releasing that water as it comes in, and every drop of water that you release in the winter reduces the probability of spill in the spring.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's all our questions. Really appreciate you both coming on today and presenting. That was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Stop sharing.
And as mentioned in chat, these presentations will be posted on our website, and the video of this meeting will also be posted on our website. And it takes a couple weeks usually for us to get that up. So let's see. Go back to the agenda here. So before we jump into the last component of roundtable updates and wrap up agenda topics, I forgot at the beginning of the meeting, we wanted to show you just a quick snapshot of our new website. So the State Water Board DIT department has redone the entire Water Monitoring Council website to make them more, to improve them drastically, to get rid of the sprawling type website and really make it a lot more user friendly. So we encourage you to go explore the website and some of the other work groups as well and see how it looks. We still have a couple of updates that need to make to it, just minor ones. So I was jotting those down earlier today when I was kind of going through the website. But other than that, it's a lot more functional and I think a lot easier to find what you're looking for. So moving into roundtable updates, does anybody have any updates that they'd like to provide to the group on anything you're working on or anything else? If so, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. Not seeing any. How about any agenda topics for future meetings? All right. What is I heard Bureau, and now I can't think of what it is.
Sorry, yeah,
What does
I
that
should.
stand for? Dan?
Forecast informed reservoir operations. That's being
Oh,
used in
yes.
some of the California reservoirs and could be coming to Oregon also.
Yeah, we can follow up with DWR and see if they have anything they're ready to present on that. Great. And Verna, is that different than the Bureau, the interface with current effort?
Yes, that's the Sigma regarding interconnected surface waters, and they should be working on it now. They got our input in, I think it was November.
Okay.
This
We can check in with DWR on that. Yes, go ahead.
is Jeff Miko. I know that Santa Clara Valley Water District operates 10 small, medium-sized reservoirs with forecast informed, using forecast informed reservoir operation strategies.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, this is Kathy. I was just have a question about groundwater. Will there be any studies or any programs to help put groundwater back into the aquifers?
We currently do have a permit for diversions for groundwater storage that is available during high flows in the winter that people can apply for. Water rights does.
And is there any current information on how low the aquifers are at this time?
I am not sure. I think that would probably be a water resource question.
Thank you.
I was just going to add to that, that we're working, a couple of us from the staff technical team and others are working on the FloodMAR in-stream flows action team to try to explore different ways that CEF, the California Environmental Flows Framework, and the functional flows approach can be used to inform FloodMAR. And so we could potentially give an update on some of the work that we're going to be trying to pilot case studies on that. I don't know when it would be ready, but maybe in a future meeting.
And some folks dropped a couple links in chat too that you can explore related to some of these questions and presentations. Anything else?
Yeah, I am curious if the California Water Quality Monitoring Program, does this include Klamath Basin water quality monitoring, or is this only for Central Valley rivers?
No, this would be statewide.
Okay.
And it's kind of focused on the environmental flow components. A lot of the water quality monitoring, there is a, is it the swamp? I'm not sure which subgroup it is, but there is a subgroup that's more specific to water quality monitoring.
Okay, thanks.
I think it's the California Water Quality Monitoring Collaboration Network. then I do also know that there are sometimes meetings that are publicly available on the Klamath specifically. Anything else?
One more question. So when the dams come
yeah.
down, and I know, I'm sorry, and the dams come down and there's all kinds of sediment. And I understand that a lot of the sediment from the Klamath has already gone through the system and out. Is there associated sediment sampling from the banks of the rivers and also from the bed and then out into the ocean to see where the plume has traveled?
I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the Klamath to be able to answer that question.
Okay.
I think I would imagine if you Google it, it'd be easy to find. There is a web page, a site dedicated to the Klamath restoration that might have some of that information, but I'm not sure what monitoring they are doing exactly and where.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you in August.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.